everyone. My name is Lannis, and I work at a place called the Leslie Science and Nature Center. Coming to you from my office to be able to generate some great information for you all about a scientific concept that we often talk about in terms of living things, and we call it food chains. Now, today, we're going to give you an outline on what a food chain actually is and why it's important, and better yet, how different scientists or ecologists or those that study plants and animals learn more about why we see certain things in certain habitats and how they all interact with each other. Because food chains play an integral or really important part in the environment that we see. But food chains, well, what is a food chain? Well, we all know that different living things have to gain different nutrients, things that help them survive, whether it helps provide energy, like when we eat a bunch of food and gain a lot of energy and want to go run around outside a bunch, or if there are certain living things that need specific kinds of nutrients, very specific kinds of food, in order for them to survive, to grow, and to live throughout their lives. So, when we talk about a food chain, here's what you want to imagine. Imagine that you have a long line, and you're working your way up from the bottom all the way to the top of that line. A food chain is how certain specific living things are all connected and interact based on who eats who and who eats what. How the living things we find in one section relate to each other, basically based on their diet. And now, a great way to think about it too is this. Let's take an example food chain. I'm going to use our whiteboard here as an example. Usually, every single food chain starts with something that isn't even alive, but it's the driving force for all kinds of living things to gather things like heat, light, and energy. And you probably already have an idea what it is. Now, I can't bring it into this room, but I can show you this, the sun. See, the sun helps provide heat, light, and energy for all living things. It helps keep us humans warm. It helps keep other cold-blooded animals warm. Sometimes, though, there are living things that actually rely on sunlight and other elements to make their own food. So, with the food chain that I'm going to build, I'm actually going to put the sun at the very bottom. Remember, we're creating a line. A lot of us might think of something we call food webs. That concept's a little different. That's talking about how things cycle through, nutrients and energy cycle through a habitat, and how we would combine what we have on the top of food chain all the way back to the bottom. We'll get to that in a little bit though. For now, let's just focus on our chain. So we start with the sun at the bottom. Okay, so now when we move up our chain or our ladder, we have to think of something that uses the sunlight to basically make its own food. Now, the technical or specific term we use for that, we call producers. In fact, there's a producer standing right behind me. Plants! Plants, things like trees, flowers, bushes, grasses, and more. Plants are an excellent example for producers. So I'm just going to put plants down here as our next one. Now, a great way to remember the word producer is this. Producers, typically we find them in the grocery store in the produce section of that store. Well, gee, the word produce sounds a lot like the word producer. That's because you're buying things from producers. Things like fruits and vegetables come from plants. And why are they called producers to begin with? That's because they can sit there and take in sunlight, among other nutrients and elements that they need, and they make sugars in their body. That's how they get their fuel. They also provide oxygen for other living things like us. Usually the term we use is called photosynthesis, how plants take sunlight and other elements and make sugars or energy and oxygen. But you can just think of it as producers making their own food. So, from there, taking the sunlight, they would be next in our food chain. This could be our first producer. Note that in a food chain, they look different every time. You can actually have multiple plants in a food chain based on how they use the sun. But to keep things a little more simple, when we go up the ladder, now we're getting into things kind of like us, mostly animals. Things that unfortunately can't just sit there in the sun and suddenly be full. We're talking about living things we call consumers. We like to consume stuff, but we, in order to eat or get our energy, have to go find ingredients or make food at home, or certain other living things, other animals specifically, have to hunt or scavenge for their food. So from there, these consumers usually make up most of the food chain. Now, what I'll do here on the food chain we make is I'm just going to put consumers in one group. Similar with plants or producers, though, you can have multiple consumers in one food chain. Mostly because it depends, again, on who's eating who or who's eating what and how they're all related to each other. Sometimes we'll use the words predator and sometimes we'll use the words prey. When I use those two words, I'm talking specifically about living things that hunt or search for other animals, other living things. That's a predator. Usually things that are called carnivores or meat eaters are great predators. Sometimes they tend to be larger, like lions or tigers. Sometimes they're smaller but can outcompete other animals, like amphibians, even some insects. And so you can really pick from these different kinds of animals and see how they interact that way. When I use the word prey, that's usually the living thing that's getting eaten or being hunted. A good example is that if you have an eagle and a rabbit, eagles have rabbits as part of their diet. So an eagle would be a predator, a rabbit would be the prey. So consumers make up a lot of those predators and those prey items in our food chain. Now there's still one part left. Usually the last part of a food chain is concluded with something we call a top predator. That's also a consumer for sure, but the top predator has to have a couple features that either help it eat everything else in the food chain or outcompete other predators, whether it's because it's the largest or the fastest or has certain features that allow it to outsmart other creatures, living things found in that habitat. But you almost always have one final predator that finishes off your food chain. So take a good look. This is what our basic food chain could look like. Remember, we're just doing a simple version today. But to give you a better perspective on how this works, let's just go ahead and try to build a food chain. Here, I actually have a couple objects on my table, and I'm going to show them to you. And we're going to kind of mix and match them up and see if we can figure out where they go. I have my fancy mystery bag here, so let's see what I find. I have a stuffed red-tailed hawk. Okay, interesting. We'll put him down here. I have an apple. Oh, interesting. How is that going to fit in the food chain? All right. I have I have the skull of a raccoon. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. You can even see the teeth and the kind of teeth it has. Oh gosh, where are they going to fit in the food chain? Okay, I have, what's this? I have, an insect. This kind of looks like a small cockroach. Okay, insects could be useful in the food chain. Let's see this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's try to find one more object. How about this guy? We have a toad. All right, useful. Okay, so let me show you our objects one more time. I have an apple. I have a red-tailed hawk, or a stuffed one. I have the skull of a raccoon. I have a cockroach, a small insect. I have a toad, or you can also say frog. And just to make our food chain accurate, we'll also have the sun in there too. Now, during this, you can either write these items down if you have a piece of paper, or if you have a really good memory and remember all of these objects, you can try to lay out in your head where they all might fit. Remember, I'm starting from the bottom and working my way up the top. So at the bottom, I'm probably going to pick our sun as our first one. We called about this driving force in our food chains, providing heat, light, and energy. Perfect. So the sun will be first. Okay, well, now I need something that uses the sunlight to make its own food. Well, cockroaches do like to hang out in the sun, but they don't actually use the sunlight to make food. They still have to go searching for it. So, how about our apple? We talked about things we found in the grocery store, a produce section being producers. Well, apples just come from apple trees, and they have to use the sunlight to make their own food. Bam! Apples after the sun. Love it. We'll even put it up top so we know we have our chain. Okay, so now I need something that could eat apples, or maybe just eats plants in general. This is our producer, which means we now go up to our consumer. Well, I could think some birds do eat plants, it's true, but hawks have other features that help them eat meat, so they probably wouldn't be next in my food chain. Maybe I'd have to choose our cockroach. You know, it is true. A lot of insects are big plant eaters, and cockroaches can eat plants. So I'll put them up as our first consumer, or if you want to be really fancy, we call it a primary consumer. However, cockroaches also eat dead plants or dead stuff, so they could sometimes fit in other areas on a food chain. But for now, we'll have our insects be next. Okay, but now going on to our second consumer, past our insect, we gotta think of something that eats insects. We still have a hawk, we still have a raccoon skull, and we still have our frog. Okay, well, I do know that raccoons eat insects, but they can actually eat a variety of stuff. So I feel like raccoons could be just about anywhere in our food chain. So I'm going to leave them on the side just to be safe. And we mentioned that while some birds eat plants, it is true that other birds eat insects, but hawks are huge. They gotta eat larger food in order to have enough energy just for their body size. So I bet the next thing that could go into our food chain would be our toad or our frog. Now we know amphibians are amazing insect hunters, especially when we talk about things like mosquitoes, flies, other flying insects, but cockroaches are a great part of an amphibian's diet. Not only are there a lot of them, but they're chock full of protein. Really good nutrients if you're a carnivorous amphibian. Alright, so our frogs would be our second consumer. Apple is our producer underneath our insect, which is our first consumer. And remember, it still all starts with the sun. We have 2 more slots left though. So if we're going now from our toad up to our next one, these are the 2 objects that remain. We have our raccoon skull and then our hawk. Now what that means is one of these has to be a top predator, has to finish off our food chain. So now we have to figure out not only which one could eat our frog, but which one would be on top. Now, just by thinking of what raccoons look like and how hawks hunt for their food, I do know that raccoons are ones that are able to hunt for meat. They also like to eat things though like eggs or plants as well. And raccoons, compared to hawks, aren't as large. I also can look at something else though, and that's the teeth of this. It's really cool that we have the skull. When I look at the teeth of a raccoon, I notice that their teeth are actually different shapes and sizes. That just means that they have different kinds of teeth in their mouth. You do too. You actually have 4 different kinds of teeth in your mouth. Crazy! That means since it eats a variety of food, it would be close to the top of the food chain. But I know for a fact that raccoons eat frogs. Not often, but they're able to catch things, especially because raccoons tend to hang out by the water. That's where they can find a lot of great food. So knowing that raccoons eat frogs more often than some other creatures, I'm going to have a raccoon be our predator or our next consumer from up above from our frog. Which leaves our top predator to be our red-tailed hawk. Now, why did I leave the hawk last as the top in our food chain? Well, not only can this hawk eat pretty much everything else that we have in our food chain, amphibians, insects, mammals, hawks are what we call raptors or birds of prey, meaning they have really cool adaptations that help them to hunt for their food. While this is just a stuffed animal, raptors have these 4 sharp toenails we call talons, and they can grab onto their food using their large feet and talons and cut up their food into smaller pieces like a knife and a fork. But if you also look at the shape of the mouth of this bird, we usually call that a beak, it's curved too, and in real life they're also sharp, meaning this animal is primarily a meat eater, taking on things like squirrels, rabbits, other birds, or even raccoons. So raptors are almost always on top of the food chain. Now, the cool thing is that while I have these objects, I can actually mix them up to make our food chain look different. That's the unique thing about food chains. You can make them or see how these animals interact differently in numerous ways. And there's not usually a wrong answer as long as you can demonstrate or explain how these animals either eat the object below it or their role in that food chain. But I told you we were also going to mention a little bit about food webs, and that's what we'll conclude with. Food webs are a little different. Well, we had our food chain, I'm going to use my whiteboard again, to be kind of in just a straight line with our arrows pointing upwards. For a food chain, you almost always start at the bottom and work your way up near the top. For a food web, it's almost like a cycle or a circular pattern. The big difference is when you're talking about a food web, you're usually looking at how all organisms in one habitat are all connected, meaning you might have multiple top predators, multiple prey items, and multiple producers, and all of these arrows going in a bunch of different directions. But in a food web, you also find a way to complete this in almost a circular fashion, meaning when your top predator passes away in a food web, you usually have something called a decomposer or a detritivore that connects things from the top all the way down to the bottom where those producers were too. We actually had an animal in our food chain that could do that. This guy. Cockroaches are a type of decomposer we call detritivores. They eat dead stuff or dead or decaying matter, usually dead plants and animals. And so while cockroaches were pretty low on our food chain, they actually would be right smack dab near the top or center of our food web because they help make sure nutrients from that top predator, once it passes away, come back down into the soil and more for other plants and animals to use. Now here's your challenge. Well, we talked a lot about food chains, these producers and consumers, and how these different animals are connected. Now what you get to do is either take the things you saw today or find something at home in your classroom with your friends and family and see if you can make a food chain just with the materials you have. Whether it's different plants and animals you find in your home or things that you're seeing out in nature, you can create hundreds of food chains in one day. Always good too if you have a piece of paper, a journal, or somewhere to record what you see, to write and draw your food chain so you can show it to others as well. But from there, I'm going to let you guys take off and try your newfound knowledge in learning more about food chains and how these living things are connected. Thanks for joining us with our lesson today. You guys have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everyone.